Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kleinman Center, the energy forum of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. My name is Mark Hughes, and it's my pleasure, still not over it, to be welcoming you physically back into our great space. It's great to kind of actually see people, and even unmasked faces are huge. So thanks for being here for this. We have a great conversation today that could not be more timely. I have a very limited mandate, though, in today's, I don't even get to introduce our distinguished speaker today. My colleague, and I'm so happy to put it that way, my colleague, Shelley Welton, gets to do that. And I'm going to introduce her very briefly. But I do want to just say one thing about the essential importance of today's topic, and especially in the context of electricity, because here you have a policy domain that is under such turbulent disruption, intersecting with what is in many ways the most important ethical and therefore political concern of the day, which is the equity issue. And so, this really is the nexus that kind of heightens the analytic leverage, but also, I think, the importance of the topic. And we've got a fantastic speaker today on this. And not unrelated to that topic is our distinguished presidential professor of law and energy policy, Shelley Welton, who's been with us almost a year on campus and is a very critical part of the Kleinman Center's agenda for the future. For the law school, Shelley teaches environmental law and a climate law seminar. And for us, she has relieved the long-suffering original instructor of the Introduction to Energy Policy. And martyrdom is best shared, as Emerson said to Thoreau. The Introduction to Energy Policy course that is the gateway for students from across the campus into the certificate program that the Kleinman Center offers. Shelley is also, and I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to joke about it. Her most recent publication, Lawyers. The footnotes start about right here, right? This fantastic casebook, again, very timely and very heavy. So I'm going to put it right back down, but is already starting to help kind of play a role in organizing a conversation around one of the more thorny aspects of the issues that we'll be talking about today, ultimately, really. So this is a really great piece of work. And there's some comments in your introduction, an aside reference to Van Jones, who I just want to say I made Van Jones. Before Van Jones was Van Jones, I'm very old. I invited him to Philadelphia to kick off the sustainability plan, Greenworks, where he was at the Franklin Institute. And a very young Van Jones, who was already super sexy and popular in terms of this, the green economy space, was a big hit here. And then he went off and became famously Van Jones. But he's a great inspiration, and I loved the reference. I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, who will take over with introducing our guest. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark, for previewing most of my intro. It really is my total delight to get to introduce Nikki Luke, who is going to talk to us today about some of her research on how subsidized job training programs in the South that are modeled after Van Jones's Green Jobs, Not Jails program grew this workforce of laborers in utilities and energy efficiency and solar panel manufacturing, but in many cases without a steady supply of good jobs to match. And as Mark said, I think this is just critical work at this junction in the energy transition, right? We are deep underway with the transition, aided by this huge new federal influx of dollars provided by the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of last year. But clean energy doesn't necessarily guarantee a more just society. And depending on how we design and implement this infrastructure transition, we could really either enrich or impoverish huge segments of society. So Nikki's talk today is based on just an amazing and really impressive range of qualitative research, including interviews and observational data across job training programs run by unions, charitable training programs, and community college programs in Georgia. I'm really excited to hear what she has to say about her findings. In addition to being a friend and collaborator, she is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And her broader research agenda includes investigations of the effects of urban energy governance on workers and communities. And in particular, she studies how power relations that are rooted in race, gender, class, and ability shape energy policy and the ability to organize for energy justice. So we are so lucky to have her here with us today. In terms of format, Nikki's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn to a moderated Q&A and questions from the audience, which includes questions from our audience on Zoom. So please ask your questions, I think in the chat box, is that right? In the Q&A box, ask your questions. I will be monitoring the Q&A box for questions. And then lunches will be available on your way out after the presentation per usual. All right, without further ado, Nikki, thanks so much.
Little further ado.
Oh, here we go. And I think I'm on. I feel like I've taught so many hybrid classes, but it doesn't get any easier 3 years into. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the introduction and for being here today. It's been a real treat to be here this week. Thank you, Professor Shelley Welton, for the introduction, to Professor Jamal Green for spending so much time with me on Monday and orienting me to campus, and to everyone here at the Kleinman Center who's made this visit possible, especially Lucy, Kim, Bill, Oscar, Angela, Corey, and Mark. I've really enjoyed getting to know some of you this week. And so I will be talking today about a recent history of green job training and how it can help us to understand the suite of recent federal legislation that I think I don't have to explain to a room full of people who are excited about energy policy, how important it is, but I will provide just a little bit of an overview. So when the Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022, I think across the United States, maybe the world, people concerned about climate change breathed a sigh of relief. The legislation is anticipated to lead to a 32 to 42% decline in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2030, on track with the US's Paris climate commitments through a combination of grants, loans, tax credits, and technical assistance to advance the energy transition. And for me, this legislation is especially interesting as it is the most recent chapter in which energy and climate policy is seen as labor policy. AFL-CIO President Liz Shuler issued a statement applauding the efforts of this bill that will deliver, quote, real help to working families. And by including, quote, labor standards and domestic content requirements, will create good paying jobs in construction and manufacturing right here in America. A study commissioned by the Blue-Green Alliance, a coalition of labor unions and environmental organizations, found that more than 9 million jobs will be created. And the Biden administration has similarly focused on measures to ensure that these jobs are good union jobs. The promise of job creation through public investment is not unique to energy policy. Local, state, and federal government programs promote the job creation potential of investments to counter the neoliberal austerity politics opposed to big government. Employment is a proxy for value creation within capitalism. Yet the job creation emphasis within the IRA is notable for two reasons. First, the focus on employment within energy politics specifically emerges to counter the long-standing narrative that environmental regulation will cost workers jobs, imagining it might be possible to use federal investment to address the uneven pain of industrial transition. Second is the focus that these jobs will be, quote, good paying union jobs. and positions in construction will pay prevailing wage and higher registered apprenticeships. Investments in the energy sector in this way attempt to counter the precipitous decline in unionization since the 1960s. The share of workers who belong to or are represented by a union fell to an all-time low of 10.21% in 2022. And at the same time, as seen in the graph here, the share of income going to the lowest paid workers has increased only slightly, while the majority of wage gains have gone to higher income earners. This is particularly concerning, as we see in these graphs here, given that jobs remain and job quality remains stratified by race, gender, and education. White workers and men remain in better paid positions, and college-educated workers are more likely to have witnessed these wage gains. Labor studies scholars argue the decline in unionization, particularly in blue-collar work, has contributed to this growing disparity. Unions are democratic organizations that workers form to represent their interests, negotiate the value of their time with their employers, and have a voice on the job. They help to define promotion and advancement opportunities tied to skill acquisition, including apprenticeship, which provides on-the-job training for workers to gain skills and progress along a career ladder. There are historical and ongoing examples of racial and gender discrimination within unions, particularly in the skilled construction trades, that cannot be overlooked. Research from the Economic Policy Institute also finds that unions can help to alleviate gender and racial disparities in pay for diverse workers within the same job classifications. And across the United States, Black workers are more likely than any other racial group to be union members. In my talk today, I want to home in on these questions of how and why good jobs are made through energy policy. In particular, I will try to answer the following three questions. Why is energy policy seen as labor policy? Why and how is workforce training central to energy policy? And how can federal policy address geographic disparities in good job creation in light of the uneven geographical development of labor markets in the United States? Based on a case study of job training and apprenticeship in Georgia, I consider the limits and possibilities of past and present green jobs politics and argue we need to pay more attention to the regional geographies of labor and labor law that inhibit federal climate policy, which works through the tax code to support good job creation in the absence of substantive labor law reform. And I will do this in 4 parts. First, I provide a very brief overview of the historical geographies of labor in the US. Second, I detail a genealogy of green jobs beginning in the 1970s to explain how the focus on training for jobs in the energy sector emerged. And third, I discuss 3 different models for job training that took root in Atlanta during the 2008 recession. To conclude, I return to recent federal legislation to ask how it has attempted to build high road labor standards in which employers compete on the quality of work, not the cost of labor. I connect these recent historical lessons from green jobs training to argue for the need for enforcement to realize good jobs in implementation of federal legislation, especially in right to work states and the US South. This research is based on 89 interviews between 2016 and 2023, including 47 interviews with training providers, workforce development officials, labor leaders, and apprenticeship coordinators working in energy and related industries. This talk is one chapter of a wider book project on energy transition in Atlanta, in which I draw from archival research and more than 5 years of participant observation with energy democracy organizing in the South that I'd be happy to talk more about if anyone's interested in the question and answer period. Situating the challenges of good job creation in the US today necessarily requires a historical grounding. And the history of labor in the US cannot be disentangled from settler colonialism, regimes of forced labor, and the ongoing racialization of the workforce. Bill Fletcher and Fernando Gopasin trace labor organizing to the collective efforts and flights to freedom of enslaved peoples, indentured servants, artisans, and sailors, which informed the union movement that emerged in the 19th century to win improvements in the lives of industrial and domestic workers. Working people have long struggled together to improve their living and working conditions and face the questions of how to build solidarity across lines of gender, race, class, nationality, geography, and occupation. Labor geographies is a branch of scholarship within economic geography that studies how working people in a range of paid and unpaid labor use formal and informal means of organizing, such as unions, community organizations, and political processes to actively shape economic landscapes and resist and react to uneven development. A central thesis of economic geography is that within capitalism, power relations shape political, social, economic, and ecological inequalities. The creation of wealth in one place might be connected to the creation of poverty, environmental degradation, and/or poor health in others. Uneven development unfolds within and across geographic scales, from a neighborhood to a city to a region, and globally through the influences of through various influences. Geographer Willie Wright adopts the term racialized uneven development to consider how the production of deficient geographies coincides with the spaces and landscapes most often made and inhabited by racialized peoples. And Wright and other Black geography scholars, including Dr. Carrie Drake Rodriguez, who I had the chance to meet with earlier this week and is here at Penn, observe that deficient or unruly landscapes are also home, refuge, and sanctuary for people marked as deviating from the norm, and are as such places to make life, to care for others, to organize, to fight the theft of time, and to enact democratic practices and work to change unrepresentative political structures. In the US, labor and social welfare law contributed to shaping racialized uneven development. The right of workers to organize was recognized in 1935 with the National Labor Relations Act, and labor organizing contributed to creating good jobs in basic industry, as collective bargaining became a centerpiece of the nation's social welfare regime. Yet the legislation was based on a piecemeal legal framework and included concessions to Southern Democrats who negotiated exceptions to labor and social welfare programs for domestic and agricultural workers who were disproportionately Black workers in the South at that time. Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues this meant, quote, the extension to the federal scale through differentiations of protection from calamity and opportunities for advancement of the South's apartheid practices. In place of a comprehensive federal system to secure a social wage, healthcare, retirement, and wages were and are negotiated through the workplace. And the early gains for the labor movement predominantly benefited white men. The legal foundation for collective bargaining has been continually weakened. While the South never had as high a union density as the North, the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act limited workers' ability to negotiate over management prerogatives such as relocation or outsourcing, and recognized state-level right-to-work provisions that have been adopted in the US South and Southwest, which make it harder to form a union. Labor and civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph observed that Taft-Hartley presented a specifically geographical problem, as industries could move to, quote, low-wage non-union states, and the Black and white working poor of the right-to-work states of the South, noted for sweatshop starvation wages, are not free to organize bona fide unions to fight for living wages. 50 years later, Jamie Peck described Taft-Hartley as a system of socio-spatial undercutting, based in, quote, a new politics of capital mobility and protecting states of regulatory exception. Right-to-work legislation became a symbol of a pro-business environment, and the trend has expanded. In the 1960s, when the union density rate stood at 31% for the country as a whole, as seen on the left here, just 23% of the US population resided in right-to-work states. In 2022, the union density rate fell to 10.1%, and 49.6% of the country's population and 45% of total employment is in right-to-work states. The expansion of right-to-work measures over time is mapped in purple here. And nationwide, the process of voting, forming a union, and winning a contract have become ever more difficult as the National Labor Relations Act is reinterpreted. State governments have also passed laws preempting other forms of worker organizing through local government. This map shows where the authority of local governments to adopt labor-friendly legislation on minimum wage, prevailing wage, fair scheduling, project labor agreements, paid leave, and the gig economy have been adopted. Less studied within the geographies of labor regimes are the specifics of workforce training. In the 1970s, Senator Hubert Humphrey and Representative Augustus Hawkins authored a bill that would start to reform the US's piecemeal approach to labor by expanding the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act of 1973 that provided employment in public service into a federal jobs guarantee. The Joint Economic Committee toured the country, visiting Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Fall River, Massachusetts, and Los Angeles to hear from city, business, community, and labor leaders. At the Los Angeles hearing, Derek Shearer, co-director of the California Public Policy Center, submitted reports by UC Berkeley researcher Patrick Heffernan into the record and argued, quote, that the protection and renewal of the urban and rural environment can be a source of millions of jobs to address the segmentation in the labor market along racial and gender lines. In my research, this is the first mention of green-collar jobs from 1976, which took inspiration from the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps. Green jobs made political sense, explained Shearer in an interview with me in 2019, because job creation policy in the 1970s built support across diverse parts of the Democratic Party. Quote, it doesn't matter what color you are, you need a good job, you need affordable housing, you need healthcare, and so that should be the glue, the economic interest. The thinking would seem to me it's pretty common sense politically. The proposal for a green collar revolution and his later advocacy of a Green New Deal beginning in the Reagan administration were ways to keep together the New Deal coalition of labor unions and people of color who continued to back the Democratic Party. Notably missing from this coalition were the Southern Democrats who largely left the Democratic Party following the Civil Rights Act. And Shearer observed, quote, that right-wing resurgence really prevented doing a lot of things. A significantly pared down version of the Humphrey-Hawkins bill was ultimately adopted. And historian Jefferson Cowie mourns this attempt to revive post-war liberalism as a New Deal that never happened. Instead, it ended as, quote, something closer to a requiem for a collective vision for the American people. The Comprehensive Employment and Training Act was repealed in 1982 and replaced by the Job Training Partnership Act that eliminated the public employment option. This move to short-term training for the poor and unemployed was justified by insisting there were already enough jobs for those prepared to take them. Subsequent reforms to welfare programs mandate that recipients of public benefits either work or be enrolled in job training, limiting some public services from cash assistance to food stamps to Medicaid in Georgia for workers or people training to become workers. The Job Training Partnership Act was updated in 1998 and again in 2014 as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. While training has long been a component of supporting workers within federal policy, in his book, The Job Training Charade, political scientist Gordon Laffer critiques the shift from job creation to training as the fundamental goal of federal employment policy, because there is little evidence that a more highly trained workforce would ensure either more jobs or higher wages. Rather, he describes that, quote, by far the most common complaint of employers focuses not on any traditionally defined skill at all, but rather on workers' discipline, punctuality, loyalty, and work ethic. These are less so skills than acquired habits that workers may choose to provide or withhold based on the wages offered. This emphasis on training is rooted in an ethos of investment in the entrepreneurial self, which, as Wendy Brown describes, takes its shape as, quote, as human capital, seeking to strengthen its competitive position and appreciate and value. By cultivating professionalism and skills, the surplus labor reserve has the potential not only to gain employment, but wealth. However, this key principle of subjectivation within neoliberalism operates in distinct ways across class and geography. Nefertiti Tadiar describes how the accumulation of human capital in the global north is tied also to state and corporate action that leverage, quote, non-subjectified labor or disposable lifetimes of populations in the global south. I translate her scholarship to consider the gendered, racialized, and carceral logics that define how we've chosen to manage the low-wage labor market in the US. For instance, Dana Davis provides an instructive study on the intersections of racial, gender, and class formation through training programs, based on her research at a domestic violence shelter, where women were guided towards training programs incongruent with their personal interests, discouraged from pursuing higher education, and pushed into low-paying service jobs as daycare workers, home health aides, and cashiers, producing an ideological continuity about what, in particular, poor Black women should be taught to do. In Atlanta, Alexander Camardelle found that WIOA funded programs for opportunity youth similarly failed to serve as a pathway for economic liberation. Instead, training captures the disposable time of unemployed surplus labor, creating the potential for employers to capture value without necessarily ensuring that trainees benefit from their investment into human capital. Training more transparently than public education can risk employing state resources to discipline people as workers in ways that are not necessarily about education or improvement, but instead the management of a surplus labor population that is intended to serve the employer. Even with the credentials earned through training programs, people struggle to move into jobs that pay a living wage, given the structure of public assistance that creates a benefit cliff, as graphed here by a Kentucky WorkSource agency, such that as the salary of someone goes up, public assistance doesn't go down proportionally. Numerous interview participants remarked that after completing requisite training, individuals will turn down raises or promotions because it would risk their housing or cash assistance benefits, lower their effective wage, and leave them back down at the poverty level. Jerry, a deputy commissioner with the Technical College System of Georgia, aptly explained why the training focus nonetheless continues. For students who are eligible for WIOA funding based on their income, the technical college will, quote, help you with the tuition, will help you with the costs, and if you have children, help with childcare while you're in school. It's kind of a blanket to help people get off welfare or never get on welfare. That's really the way you can look at it. So I joke that this is one of the few federal programs that all the political spectrums are okay with. You know what I mean? I mean, nobody argues with this stuff. Training programs from this perspective are a politically neutral way to manage low-wage labor markets, which is itself reproduced through the refusal to raise the minimum wage to a level adequate to meeting a household's daily needs. Training takes people out of work when there are not sufficient jobs available and supports recruitment for employers in high-demand careers. Many people learn and gain access to employment that transforms their lives through training programs. Yet, what I'm interested in today are the various ways in which green jobs training programs have been constructed, which ones have best worked and which ones have failed in helping participants transform their circumstances. In particular, I'm interested in the ways in which public funding can be better used to help support the security of workers who continue to face poverty and address the forms of discrimination that shape the racialized and gendered uneven development of the labor market. So we're getting back to energy, because this policy history affects the movement for green jobs that was revived under the Clinton administration in response to climate and environmental justice concerns. President Bill Clinton mentioned the job creation potential of environmental action in his presidential Earth Day address in 1993, in ways that now sound very similar to what President Biden has said around the IRA, stating that, quote, policies must protect our environment, promote economic growth, and provide millions of new high-skill, high-wage jobs. The following year, he signed Executive Order 12898 on federal actions to address environmental justice, which resulted from years of activism across the United States from environmental justice communities. And environmental justice leaders, including Robert Bullard and Dumping and Dixie, had made the case that environmental justice is a labor issue because polluters often use, quote, jobs blackmail to push polluting forms of economic development in poor Black, Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant communities with limited other employment options. The environmental justice movement named racial and economic justice as twinned issues that environmentalists and preservationists had failed to see or act on. Building on these initiatives, Van Jones launched the Green Jobs Not Jails campaign in 2004 as part of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland, California. This was later expanded through the organization Green for All that worked in cities across the United States, including Atlanta. And in an interview published in the journal Antipode in 2009, Jones argued that green jobs strategically harness a market-based approach. He explained, quote, my program is Green Jobs Not Jails because it addresses the two worst aspects of the present US reality. We have throwaway people, throwaway neighborhoods, throwaway children thrown into prison, and we also act as if we have a throwaway planet. The answer to both the social and ecological crisis is somewhere in the direction of less ecologically devastating forms of economic life. Jones defines green jobs as, quote, family supporting career track, vocational or trade level employment in environmentally friendly fields, and aspires for these positions to create both financial stability and meaningful work for those marginalized within the Bay Area's economy. While Jones became the face of green jobs, other coalitions, including the Apollo Alliance, the Emerald Cities Collaborative, and the Blue Green Alliance, did vital work to champion these issues at the local, state, and national levels, focusing on green jobs, which are primarily in construction and not to be outsourced. This organizing joined civil rights groups and organized labor, echoing the convergence of the Democratic base that Derek Shearer had envisioned. President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which directed federal funding towards green energy projects and training for careers in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and environmental protection industries. He appointed Van Jones as the nation's green job czar, who briefly championed these initiatives before he was forced to resign. Yet stimulus money filtered through a workforce development bureaucracy attuned to job training and not sustained job creation. Whereas successful programs in the Bay Area had required years of coordination between the utility, city, labor, and community-based partners to recruit, train, and place workers into pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs, implementation varied and was contingent on local labor law and existing political relationships. Laura, an employee at a workforce development agency in Atlanta, described, quote, there was this huge Department of Labor funding, again in 2009, for shovel-ready jobs, and green jobs was the big thing they threw all this money at. I just remember hearing the people at the workforce development agencies kind of going, quote, well, that was kind of a big boondoggle. It's not terribly well thought out and successful. Eric, a federal government employee working in Atlanta to disperse stimulus funding, also explained that there was little accountability to the vision of creating career pathways to train and place workers. From his perspective, green was, quote, a little icing on the cake. But when we report to Congress, we're not reporting green, we're not reporting workforce, we're reporting 200 jobs, 70 million in private investment, and Congress doesn't care necessarily what those jobs or private investment is doing. We're in the public infrastructure business. We're not in, policing companies and how much they pay their employees. Without attention on where and how funding is dispersed, local, state, and federal agencies stuck to narrow mandates. The city of Atlanta put some stimulus funding to use to implement sustainability goals. Rebecca, a former city official, described that as part of this, they pulled together a green jobs task force because, quote, it was the sexy thing to do, right? And I think it suffered from all these things we still see green jobs suffer from today. It is like, what do you mean? What are you actually going to do? More than just talk about it. And so we just kind of floundered. Despite this, there were three notable trajectories for the different projects that took root within Atlanta and influenced the city's approach to clean energy today. The first is an apprenticeship model. The second is widely recognized as a failed nonprofit-driven model for green jobs. And the third proceeds through the state's technical colleges. These stakeholders represent, the stakeholders within these different programs are not mutually exclusive, and each of them rely on public funding to some degree. The first Green Jobs project was initiated between the city's Green Jobs Task Force, the Emerald Cities Collaborative, and Georgia's Strategic Alliance for New Directions and Unified Policies, or Georgia Stand Up, which established a pre-apprenticeship program with the skilled trades based on the idea that any clean energy policy should have a paid on-the-job training component that is community-driven toward improving the quality of life for working-class people in the city. Pre-apprenticeships are programs that support workers in preparing to meet the criteria to apply for an apprenticeship. And in the construction sector, federally registered apprenticeships are the gold standard in workforce training and certification. Apprenticeships are industry-driven and often managed and funded through joint contributions of employers and unions to train new entrants in the fields for a career in a particular trade. Apprentices receive work experience, progressive wage increases tied to skill acquisition, and a combination of on-the-job and classroom instruction. They graduate with a portable, nationally and industry-recognized credential, certifying someone as a plumber or a heavy machine operator. Just for instance, And this collaboration worked to bring young people into the building trades and support the Atlanta Better Buildings Challenge. In the years since, Georgia Stand Up has also led work around voter registration and outreach. While the union-focused training program focused on large commercial building retrofits, the second Green Jobs Readiness Program was chartered by an environmental nonprofit that opened the Southeast Weatherization and Energy Efficiency Training Center, or SWEET Center, which is being unveiled in the photo here. The center trained over 2,700 people in a range of green building practices, from contractors to young people who worked with community action agencies to weatherize homes for low-income households in Atlanta, with the goal of increasing comfort, reducing energy use and thus bills, and creating jobs for underemployed youth. Trey, who coordinated to have more than 40 Youth Build students from the city work with the program, explained that, quote, "We saw a potential market for this work as an opportunity to go out and try to build a program that we could go into the community, especially with elderly people, and do this energy efficiency improvement work. And unfortunately, that didn't take off like we thought it was going to. There wasn't interest or trust in different neighborhoods who the program wanted to serve. And without ongoing support from the city or utility to implement energy efficiency, there was not a pathway to employment for youth who graduated from this program once the stimulus money dried up. Several years later, Youth Build donated the equipment it had purchased to train workers with the stimulus grant to the single student from the program who was still in that line of work. When Atlanta adopted a resolution committing the city to procure 100% of its energy from renewable sources in 2018, Josh, a workforce development coordinator with the environmental nonprofit that had run the SWEET Center, said the organization was not interested in revising that Green Jobs curriculum, and the center itself has since closed, because they do not, quote, "want to train to unemployment." Green jobs as a category suffered from a lack of definition and demand. And the current focus on apprenticeship in the IRA acknowledges and attempts to learn from this history by incentivizing training through registered apprenticeships that allow graduates to work in solar, nuclear, commercial building construction, among other areas. There was a third major prong to recession-era training initiatives flying under the radar of the green jobs enthusiasm. And a program that did see enormous success was housed in the technical colleges. There are 22 technical colleges across the state that provide various professional and vocational training. For more than 50 years, the state has offered what it calls a quick start program for any new company coming to Georgia, or an employer that is adding a new product that will create at least 15 jobs. The technical colleges will provide an assessment of exactly what the workforce needs for a company will be, create a training plan, and help to recruit and train their first cohort of employees without a charge to the company. Non-credit programs are not eligible for state funding, so participants either have to pay tuition or WIOA funding can cover the cost for those who are eligible. And as the technical colleges continue to run the program as needed for employers. Jury, in an interview, boasted in an obvious joke about my PhD credentials that, quote, "The role of the technical colleges is different. We try to keep in touch with business and industry. That's really why we exist. We're not studying the Higgs boson particles or any other things like that. We're just putting people into the workforce or enabling them to get into the workforce. So everything we do is based on what industry in the area needs. It's kind of one of our big secrets in Georgia about how we attract and do such good business for business." The benefits for workers who complete these programs are immediate job placement, and the technical college tries to only train people for jobs worth staying in. In Atlanta, a reproductive justice living wage, enough for a person working in a single-headed household to support a family, requires a job that pays $25 to $28 an hour. During the recession, Jerry detailed that solar manufacturing facilities that benefited from federal tax credits were established in the Atlanta area. And, quote, "There was this big, we're going to go solar. And we got with industry and worked with that. A lot of that industry didn't take, but some are still in operation and going strong, and we're still providing them with workforce." These early programs set the stage for the state to continue to work with other clean energy employers. In 2022, I participated in a site visit to another technical college training program developed in collaboration with electric utilities to train line workers, as pictured here. Emily, another employee with the Technical College Economic Development arm, described that the program costs $5,000 for people who are not eligible for WIOA, and was designed to meet a projected demand for 400 new line workers for different utilities across the state. When I asked her why the utilities had helped to stand up the training program in the technical college, rather than have students complete training in-house, she said this is something she's thought a lot about. Answering, quote, "It means that instead of having to spend 4 or 5 weeks on training someone with no knowledge, it could enable the utilities training folks to sort of expedite their training process, so that when students come through here, they can start at a more advanced level, as they've already had the entry-level training. And that's really the purpose and mission of the technical colleges in Georgia, to provide the foundational skill sets needed so that employers can build that. But this requires the state and individuals to take on a financial commitment that might otherwise be internalized within a resourced private industry. Since these 3 modes of training pathways were first enacted in quote unquote green industries in Georgia, beginning in the recession, Georgia has powered to the front of the nation's clean energy economy. Since 2018, 35 electric vehicle-related projects have invested $23 billion in the state. 5 major facilities, including also solar and battery manufacturers announced in the past year, total more than $14 billion in private investment, which has also been made possible in part by $3.3 billion in state incentives, and training remains front and center. For instance, the state committed its technical college Quick Start program as part of a $1.5 billion incentive package offered to an electric truck manufacturer, Rivian, last year, offering to provide up to 43 different kinds of training modules. Distinct from the apprenticeship programs valued in the IRA, this does not necessarily provide a portable or industry-recognized credential. Often in manufacturing, an employee might be trained on a specific part of a production line that doesn't translate into a skill they can take into another workplace or industry if they have to move or don't like their job. But Georgia provides these benefits because the company has committed to invest at least $5 billion and to create 7,500 jobs, paying an average of $56,000 a year. However, if you read into the details of the several 100-page contract between the state and the employer, the jobs requirement will be filled if Rivian creates or contracts the required number of net new jobs, paying at least $20 an hour for a minimum of 35 hours a week, which is about $20,000 less than the $56,000. These jobs must have the opportunity to access, but not necessarily paid or subsidized medical benefits. The state has again used its muscle to create a pro-business environment and missed opportunities to support job quality for workers in ways that continue a pattern of geographic uneven development. The use of state funds to subsidize development creates a barrier for unions that are also interested in job quality. In Georgia and many other states in the South, it is unlawful if state or municipal funding is attached to a project to have a project labor agreement in place, which is a contract between unions and contractors working on a site, or a stipulation to pay prevailing wage, which is a wage rate determined by the Department of Labor based on the average wage rates for skilled labor at the county level. Both of these measures increase the competitiveness of union contractors who bid on projects by eliminating competition based on lowest cost. Luke, a labor leader in Georgia, described that the IRA provides, quote, a little bit of encouragement because that is federal money coming to Georgia. And so therefore we can go after prevailing wage and also enter into project labor agreements with the utility companies on these. That will help even for solar installations that are part of this program. It'll help lead them toward union contractors and union jobs. But if it doesn't have federal funding, you're dealing with day laborers pretty much. For the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers in Georgia, the use of day laborers to install solar and build manufacturing facilities has caused particular consternation. The union estimates that workers who are union members have received less than 10% of work in Georgia's solar industry, and the US Energy and Employment Report puts this number even lower at 4.6%. compared to the union's market share of 15 to 20% in utility construction. Blake, another union leader, described that the industry isn't fostering careers, and that in solar, with the dependence on day laborers, you don't see, quote, high-paying jobs, livable wage jobs, where people can, own a house and a vehicle and get back and forth to work and have a budget where they can still enjoy the 8 hours of recreation. That's what we all work for. Despite these concerns of workers, in a speech to Georgia's congressional delegation, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp framed federal climate policy as an existential question to Georgia's booming green energy industry, cautioning, quote, "You have a choice, jobs for hardworking Georgians or jobs for labor unions." Yet federal policy rejects this binary, framed within a post-business state of leaders in the South, where suppressing unions has long been an economic development approach. Instead, it presents a unique inroad to improve outcomes for workers and attempt to build high road practices in the South and right-to-work states more broadly. The Inflation Reduction Act relies on two standards that increase the competitiveness for union contractors. First, the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 applies, which requires prevailing wage for any contracts receiving federal funding over $2,000. In addition, many of the programs require that a certain share of work go to people in registered apprenticeship programs. There are challenges to creating a high road workforce, both because there are fewer tools available to ensure job quality in manufacturing. And even in construction, Luke described that despite these measures, the unions, quote, "have to pay attention to it. We got to make sure there's accountability with that. Just in general construction, one of his colleagues is doing Freedom of Information Act requests on municipalities for affordable housing. And even some of their infrastructure projects that have federal money tied to it, they're not even paying prevailing wage. Because one of the things that a state like Georgia does is the enforcement mechanism just isn't there, even down to things like safety. While unions are one tool to improve job quality, they are important particularly as they are a means provided within federal legislation. To make the energy transition equitable and create good jobs requires enforcement of these measures. While federal energy policy requires to create good quality jobs, it must contend with the stagnation of labor standards that have created poor quality work for working people across the US, especially in right-to-work states, which include much of the US South. The IRA implementation confronts the broader legal and geographic shifts that created a segmented labor market and stifled union power to achieve its objectives in racial and economic justice. Today, I've outlined that recent federal policy promises to create, yet again, these millions of jobs in clean energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing, and uses tax credits, grants, loans to impose high labor standards. Since 2009, cities and states have learned from numerous green jobs training efforts to establish more effective pathways to benefit workers. Efforts to connect trainees to positions directly or apprenticeships through recent federal funding, including and beyond the Inflation Reduction Act, requires enforcement for these gains to be realized. More work remains to be done to ensure that high road labor practices, especially in right-to-work states and in the South, curtail geographic competition at the expense of workers and instill a social wage as core to achieving equity and democracy in the transition to clean energy. And that's all I have.
All right.
Do we have, yeah.
There we go. Nikki, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. So again, we're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute. And if you are on Zoom, I invite you to please send them through the Q&A. I have it here, so I will be monitoring it. But I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask just a couple of things because your talk raised so many interesting questions and issues. Okay, first, based on my recent obsession that Mark previewed, I wanted to ask you about utilities in this world, right? Like, I just moved from the South. This is a world of serious utility power and dominance in a lot of these southern states. And on the one hand, I understand that utilities have like long been a source of very good jobs in the South. On the other hand, they've been super resistant to a lot of green jobs fields like energy efficiency and building small scale renewable resources. So I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about the role that utilities have played on the plus and the minus side for green jobs, and if you see sort of the landscape shifting at all there.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I can speak specifically, I guess, to questions in Georgia, where, as you said, we have a vertically integrated regulated utility that serves 70% of the state, which is Georgia Power. And they have historically had this very strong labor agreement with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers that goes back to World War I, and has been in place for a really long time. And that means, unlike in other construction sectors or other private industries in Georgia, there's a collective bargaining agreement that's been in place that represents about 20%. About 20% of Georgia Power's employees are in power plants and construction fields are members of the IBW, and then that collective bargaining agreement also represents all those other workers too. And there's been a huge concern, particularly with the closure of coal-fired power plants, that there isn't negotiation with the union or isn't representation of they haven't been consulted in some of these decisions about new power generation. And most of the solar fields in Georgia, which I believe now has, I don't know the megawatts, but it has the 9th most installed solar capacity in the United States, according to the Solar Energy Industries Association, has been built by non-union contractors through power purchase agreements, which further erode this compact between organized labor and the utility. And I think that that's a trend that a lot of union members are afraid will continue. Utilities also have a lot of authority, and there's been a long-standing effort on behalf of all the other unions that represent working people to try and raise issues of just the cost of energy in general. And there hasn't been a lot of attention in Georgia specifically to some of those issues related to home energy efficiency, residential energy efficiency, that are also part of the ways in which we see utilities impact working people's lives.
Thanks, that's great. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to ask you about is just sort of your take on the theory of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Like, as I understand it, and you probably know this stuff better than I do, there's like a push piece that is we'll do prevailing wage, we'll do these apprenticeship programs and try to do the sort of job training angle that you talked about happening in Atlanta, with like some limited success in actually placing people in these long-term jobs. And then I guess the like pull piece, or the sort of demand for jobs piece in the Inflation Reduction Act, is their onshoring requirements, like this requirement that we do more here at home. And I just wonder, like, is that the right push and pull based on your research, or is that not enough to create the kind of like sustained long-term jobs that we're looking for?
So I think that the push piece is mostly through tax credits.
Yeah.
And so those people building solar in all sorts of, based on where you build it, or other clean energy implementation, not just solar, but that's been a huge focus. Your employers are eligible for an additional tax credit if they hire a certain share of registered apprentices as part of their program, which is a huge incentive to try and work with union contractors, because it's very hard to get an apprenticeship registered. And so there are criteria that have traditionally benefited these longstanding apprenticeship programs with a proven track record of graduating a certain number of people and placing them into high wage employment. So it's hard in that sense. The training criteria have really evolved since the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which remains a mouthful. And we no longer see just that funding available for training programs where there isn't a guaranteed job at the end. The question, while this is specific to the construction industry, the question in manufacturing is there isn't that same pipeline. There aren't the same levers available to say you have to pay prevailing wage, or you have to have a certain number of registered apprentices. that creates and incentivizes a training pathway that has been proven to help lead people into high wage, good jobs. And so in manufacturing, you see all of these other questions of what training might look like or how workers are recruited emerge, which is the case of the electric vehicle production facility in Georgia, where the state has said, we'll recruit and provide those workers for you, but there isn't a guarantee that if someone doesn't like their job, they don't have the same portable skills that arise from whatever training and program they might participate in the manufacturing sector. Does that?
Yeah,
answer your
yeah,
question?
totally. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to open it up for you all. So the other thing that I've heard critiqued from the left about the Inflation Reduction Act is that it is fundamentally like very much leaning into the market model of let's throw some tax incentives out there and let's see who wants to build what, right? And it doesn't do very much at all of what many on the left have pushed for, which is lean into public ownership, right? As a different strategy of how to do this build out. And because you're from Tennessee, I can't not ask you about public ownership, right? Because the dominant entity in Tennessee in electricity provision is the Tennessee Valley Authority, publicly owned entity. So I just wonder, like being in the space that you're in the South, how do you think about the role of public ownership as an alternative way to do good jobs?
This comes up all the time, particularly since I've moved to Tennessee and have continued doing interviews with people across the South, where everyone says, you know, in areas outside of the Tennessee Valley Authority territory, it's a fight. You're constantly working with each individual employer or constantly trying to get the attention of the utility to maintain high wage and benefit standards. And so just back to your previous question, unions have to, in the United States, work to get a contract with each individual employer that they're working with. So while some of the building trades unions have these strong, long-standing agreements with big established utilities, they actually don't have them with rural electric co-ops or municipal utilities. And in some cases, municipal utilities have a prohibition on working with organized labor. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority is just this constant reference of this is where we feel safer on the job, we get better paid for the work that we do. There are pathways to ensure to talk to your employer if you have concerns at work, and it's really seen as a model that's better for working people. I think people within the Tennessee Valley Authority also have concerns that that has changed over time, and that sort of partnership between workers and their employer isn't as strong as it once was. But for the most part, public ownership is seen as, particularly in the South, where union density is so low, and there haven't been the same successes in increasing minimum wage or using other strategies to try and increase the quality of work. Having particularly federal agencies there is really influential. But that said, I think the model of the rural electric co-ops or municipal utilities show that public ownership doesn't always guarantee like the highest quality or the highest, the best outcomes for workers.
So is it something about the federal nature of the TVA then, or just sheer scale?
I think it's scale. I think in its history that there's this longstanding agreement there. And then it's also the federal nature is really important. And that goes back to these measures that are implemented in the IRA, that when there's federal funding attached to any project anywhere in the country, there are certain wage and benefit thresholds that start to be triggered and are put into place.
All right, let's open it up for audience questions. Start over here.
I wanted to ask you.
Hi, I'm Zach Goldberg. And Nikki, I wanted to ask you about, I guess, like migratory labor in like energy jobs in particular in my research, which is mostly focused in both fracking and solar. Like most jobs are, especially in Pennsylvania, they don't come from people. They're people working at these sites are not from Pennsylvania. And so it seems like, at least in non-manufacturing jobs, energy jobs are very mobile. And I just want to, I'm just like curious where that comes up in your work, maybe looking at the IRA and green jobs training and the mobility and maybe like especially if states are funding these programs, how do they show up when your workers are moving around or just not from the area?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I think in my research, I've seen that come up in two different ways. I can't turn my cool chair very well to see, but one way is Georgia is currently building one of the only, I think the only nuclear reactor that's under construction still in the United States, Plant Vogtle, which requires just a huge workforce. And so there are a lot of people at Plant Vogtle who have come from all over the country at different points, particularly when they've had to meet clear targets for construction to build up and really ramp up the workforce. And so that's had a significant impact in this particular county where it's under construction. They've seen investment in, increasing tax revenue that just comes from having a lot of people there, but that's not necessarily built, that's not sustained into the long term. The other way in which you really see it's less like national migration, as in the case of Plant Vogtle, but you see like some more local or regional patterns of migration in the building of big solar fields. So that's, that construction project might happen for a couple weeks, a couple months, and people will either drive down every day from a bigger city like Macon or Atlanta to go work at a site, but they're not really living and part of that community necessarily. And I think the aspiration for a lot of people is that the IRA might provide some certainty to stabilize that industry, so that the industry has for a long time relied on temp labor, it's relied on really poor working conditions, it's tried to compete on being the lowest possible, cheapest option. And that if there's a certainty that there's continued interest, investment, a push to build out solar and achieve a net zero target, which is only a voluntary target in the case of the big utility in Georgia, then it might allow people to set up more of a pipeline of employees in a variety of energy efficiency, different kinds of renewable fields.
Hannah?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Luke. Really insightful talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you would hope, based on your research, that federal agencies will do in forthcoming guidance to really shore up the implementation of the prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards in light of what apprenticeship programs have worked best, what kind of enforcement models have worked best.
Yeah, that's a great question also. And I think that there's a sense in the workers and labor leaders who I've talked to that there isn't any kind of enforcement present. So they don't know if they are aware, like in an interview I did a couple weeks ago, someone referenced that some work was being done on the federal courthouse in Atlanta, and there's ways around, like if the work has to be done and you can't find a contractor who is a union signatory contractor to do the work, that other contractors can be used, or there's ways around these criteria that are there for good reasons in terms of getting the work done, but that those are often relied on, and people who have a contract, a federal contract, don't try that hard to try and meet the criteria, or the workers who they hire don't know that it's federal work and prevailing wage should be offered. And so I think from the perspective of union leaders who feel like they have to enforce a lot of this themselves, knowing who they could ask or who they could go to, from OSHA to the Economic Development Authority to folks within the Department of Labor, would help a lot. And then I know that there's a lot more work being done from the person who I quoted who had worked on the federal government stimulus funding dispersal where he said, we don't care how much people are making on the projects that we're funding. We just care that the money is getting out the door. I think that attitude is changing a lot, and there's quarterly reporting that's required to say, who are you hiring? What are the quality of jobs that are in these positions? And so in part, I'm curious to see if those new reporting requirements will prevent some of the undercutting of work quality that we saw in the stimulus package.
All right, we're going to take one question online and then we're going to come back to the room. Okay, so this question begins, great talk, Dr. Luke, exclamation mark. Can you talk a bit more about the troubles of unions as democratic organizations, specifically the racism and sexism that has traditionally plagued the trades unions? We have resistance from local advocates about green union jobs, as this has been an issue in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it can't be I definitely, particularly from my vantage point, where there's such a disparity between the quality of work within unions and out for those who don't have that protection and also as someone who is a union member, see this as a very positive area. But I know that there are, of course, a history and ongoing practices of racism and sexism, particularly within the skilled trades unions, that are really challenging to think about how do we support high wage pathways within these industries or organizations that haven't supported all workers. And so I think this is also a question where some of the issues of access to data and availability and transparency are important in relation to the previous question. Unions only collect information on their apprentices and not on the total overall composition of journeymen and union members. And so over time, we see based on this information that the diversity, particularly of apprentices and hopefully of union members, is increasing, that there are more people of color, more women who are being enrolled within the trades. But in the South, you also, in a recent report that the North American Building Trades Unions put out, you see this takes there's a particular geography to this, so that Latino and Latino workers are more represented in the West, Black workers are more represented in the South. And it doesn't get to these established longstanding concerns of cities like Philadelphia or Boston, which have been extensively reported on as failing to meet criteria for supporting workers of color. And so I think that important programs that have been implemented to try and address some of these concerns, from pre-apprenticeship programs to recruit workers, but then also to ensure that they have support and guidance of mentorship and are not going into a job where they're going to be harassed or face discrimination, that's really centered as part of what we must achieve in any sort of public project that supports working with organized labor. So I guess I'm saying it's very challenging, but there are ways that different community organizations in particular have worked with the building trades to try and not just increase diversity, but make sure you have a more inclusive work site and one that's more equitable, where there are opportunities for people to feel like they do have a voice on the job and are represented within their union as well.
All right, back to the room. I saw several more hands. Yeah. That's you.
Hello, I'm Robert. I'd like to know if there's anybody in this room that is a representative of the Building Trades Union. Anybody from Local 98 or anywhere else? They're not here.
Questions in the room? Go ahead, Angela.
This question is because there is a general feeling there is a shortage of labor for many of these clean industries, especially when you hear this announcement that there are going to be mega factories that are going to need to be constructed quite quick. But so given that expectation and right now, the effect of COVID that really aggravated this shortage. So have you seen a decreased trend in this gap between unionized wages and non-unionized wages? Because you may expect that those wages in some way, given the shortage, should have been up for both, but especially for the non-unionized, given the higher demand, they should be up, no? And the gap decrease in some way?
Yeah, I think if you, in the data that I shared at the very beginning of my talk, you see that there has been an increase in median wages, particularly for the lowest paid workers over the past several years, given the worker shortage. But there is still a disparity between, particularly in the construction industry, between workers who benefit from prevailing wage and those who are in more temporary or less formal positions. That's been a long-term trend that has, as I said, narrowed slightly with just the tightness in the labor market, but hasn't eliminated this long-term difference between higher paid and less paid construction work.
All right, one more question from online. How have you seen organized labor respond to the new world of gas bans, right? So these bans on new gas hookups that I think are predominantly taking place at the city level, but maybe some also at the state level. So they ask, how do you think these laws might benefit unions as well?
This is a really good question that I haven't thought that much about because it hasn't happened in the geography that I study. I know there's some really good research on this that if this person wants to email me, I can point them to in the case of California, where unions have advocated against gas bans. But I think in any context where there's large scale infrastructure projects, there's the possibility, particularly again, where it's a larger project to have to meet some of these conditions for having better quality jobs. And I think that that's another significant issue of just what green jobs in the future of the clean energy sector will look like, is all of the people who are contractors and do residential work, who have to learn new skills and develop a new line of their business or a new aspect of the work that they do in converting homes from gas to electrification.
Nice positioning, Bill. So that was such a fun talk. Thank you. I mean, it really did raise a lot of questions. And I wanted to ask one from a long time ago when I was working on these issues. And I will disclose that it was when JTPA governed and all the attention was about the reauthorization that led to WEA. And at that time, there was a sense and some work that was done around the importance of the administrative geography that we were using to try to deal with some of these employment training, but also placement issues at once. And, back then, it was pretty easy to substantiate the claim that we couldn't design a better system to isolate areas of greatest excess labor supply from areas of excess labor demand. And same was true for the administrative geography of the federal housing system and so on, right? So I'd spent a lot of time hand drawing maps of fragmented administrative geography. And has any of that, those kinds of challenges at the scale of the metropolitan labor market, and Atlanta was one of the places that we looked at a lot, does any of that come through today in any of your key informants discussions about, this additional layer of challenges? I don't actually even know if SCAs still have to enter into special agreements to, direct the resources from the employment system to make it a placement outside of the county in which the resident, all of this kind of crazy stuff. Does any of that still kind of matter or come through in the real world?
I think some of that still matters when you're talking about the segment of workers who are like WIOA eligible, because the geography of where they are dictates if they're eligible, the kinds of benefits they can receive, the kinds of training programs they might be connected to. The question of an excess labor supply versus demand, I think has been skewed a lot by some of the questions that Angela was raising about a really tight labor market currently. And I see more in the context of rural labor questions of like, how do you address issues of transit? How do you address issues of, a training program might be an hour and a half away, and then the facility where you might possibly end up getting a job is an hour and a half in a different direction. So some of those concerns are less concentrated in the recent interviews I've done in urban areas.
All right, I might ask you, since you invited this in your talk, and I think green jobs is obviously a really important piece of the conversation around energy democracy and a just transition, but not the only piece. So I wonder if you might talk about sort of how you see your work on green jobs folding into the broader conversation around energy democracy. And I think this gets maybe towards you talking about your book project a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the question of energy democracy is about how people have a greater say, participation, and influence in the energy system, and can help transition the energy system to one that is representative of their values, the greater needs of their community, the investments and concerns that extend beyond, to questions of housing quality, to questions of job quality, to concerns about transportation. And in that way, it requires thinking about the time and effort that people spend at work, which is a huge part of what we all do every day, and how the conditions of work, both within the energy sector, but also outside of it, are part of asking what the energy sector that we want to see looks like. Does it create jobs that are these quality jobs that pay family sustaining wages and benefits, that are a way of using public funding where available, or using funding that comes through the rates that we all pay for electric bills, for gas bills, to build the kind of infrastructure that supports and sustains communities more broadly. And so, yes, I've looked at that in the question of thinking about the energy transition in Atlanta and how we see issues of job creation, of job training, and of environmental justice more or less reflected in the ways in which people engage the utility in saying, we have a vision of what our community could look like, and we have an idea of how an institution that is quasi-public could work with us to achieve some of these objectives that are about engaging in a more democratic process to give light to those issues or concerns of a broader constituency.
All right, question here.
Hi, my name is Dara. Thank you for the talk. It seems like there's a push and pull right now, a big push for more industrial scale solar, which we need a lot of in order to transition to 100% clean energy. But it seems like the jobs are in the residential sector. So to me, it seems like we need a balance of industrial scale and residential. We need both parts of the solar industry to make these jobs work. And generally residential jobs, solar jobs aren't union. They're small local businesses, and then there's some national ones, but they're not unionized. Same with like weatherization jobs. They're generally not, you go in house to house. It's nice because you can have someone stay in their home city and it's not transitory like, like a utility scale installer would be. But it's a good job and people can make a good, decent salary and learn new skills. The electricians that are doing those jobs have, going house to house, they're doing those jobs. So what's your thought on making sure that those jobs, because they're really probably not going to be unionized, are good jobs, that we train people for those jobs, that they are paid well, and that they're diverse and equitable and just jobs that are lasting and can support families?
So I think that those jobs, even if they're more, even if it's, more one-off, like someone has a small solar installer company, or you're working through a public entity, like in the town where I live, a lot of the weatherization work is done by the Community Action Agency. And so in either context, it's a smaller scale, and there hasn't hit, you're exactly right. Most of those most residential work in construction, not just in the energy sector, is not unionized. But there are still, in different contexts, when public money is attached, prevailing wage requirements to say this is a minimum wage that people should be receiving for this kind of work. And I think the question also, and particularly when you're thinking about a state like Georgia or Tennessee that hasn't taken the Medicaid expansion, is that part of what quality work is looking at is unions are a way that unions provide retirement and healthcare benefits to workers. And so for me, those questions of all of the other kinds of work, like home electrification, weatherization, residential and community solar, how can those be organized at a scale that is sufficient to provide adequate wages and benefits, even if those workers have not chosen to come together and form a union. And so that is, I think, a possibility when you do see public funding attached to it, that there are these, again, higher wage requirements. And ensuring continued job quality is something that I'm also really hopeful about in the IRA, that there will be more of a market for this and it's less of a niche occupation. Or in the case of weatherization, something that happens and then the funding dries up and it doesn't happen again for a while. So it's done by people in unpaid training programs or volunteers, that as we see this market mature, there is more of just an understanding that this is good work that needs to be done and continue to be done to improve the efficiency and sustainability of our built environment.
That seems like a beautiful place to end. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for being here. Oh, I have a few closing announcements that I'm supposed to make. All right, so this presentation was recorded. It will be available on the website tomorrow. There are lunches on your way out. If you enjoyed this conversation with Nikki, she is also going to be on the Energy Policy Now podcast hosted by Andy Stone of the Climate Institute. I think that's scheduled for next week, right? So stay tuned for that. And then also we have Energy Week coming up March 20th to 24th. It's 5 days of energy focused events all across campus, ranging from Kleinman's hosting a talk on how the war in Ukraine is affecting global energy security, to things like what Penn is doing on decarbonizing our own campus. So thank you all again so much for joining us, and please enjoy your lunches.